All right, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to have you all here. So welcome to the Distinguished Visitors Lecture Series, our first talk for the 2019 winter semester. So I'm actually just doing a very quick introduction of our introducer, which is Professor Brenda Gunn. Our talk today is going to be focusing on the rights of Indigenous peoples under public international law. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Erika Yamada. She is here all the way from Brazil, so we should be extra, I think, appreciative that people are willing to travel to our fine city in the dead of winter and share her expertise. I have a bit of her bio here. She has an SJD from the University of Arizona in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy. She has an LLM from Lund University in Sweden with a focus on human rights and humanitarian law. She's currently a member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, representing Latin and the Caribbean. She has done a ton of work, including both in Brazil and internationally. And in addition to today's talk, she's also going to be speaking tomorrow or Saturday, I can't remember now, at the conference, now I forgot to practice how to say this, Kiskinohamatuan, which is starting tomorrow. So thank you so much for coming, Erika, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to start acknowledging that we are meeting on traditional territory of the Treaty 1 peoples and the homeland for the Métis Nation. And I'm really honored and thanked to be here. And also, if there are other Indigenous students and researchers, it's an honor for me. It's that, right? I have to speak louder. Is it good?
It's fine.
Okay. So I would also like to express my gratitude to the University of Manitoba for organizing this event and for inviting me to be here. It is true that I left Brazil and it's summer season, so I left the beach to be here, but it's always good to breathe, different airs and to share some of the things we are now facing in Brazil. So I'm very happy to be able to address some words regarding the situation of the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, mostly focused in Latin America, and then of course I will speak a bit more about Brazil, where I come from and where Indigenous people are facing difficult challenges right now. As you may know, Latin America is home for more than 45 million Indigenous people and corresponding to more than 9% of the total regional population. But Latin America is also hosts an immense diversity of peoples. In most countries in Latin America, Indigenous peoples are known as the guardian of the forest and of biodiversity, with an impact of global scale for climate change and biodiversity. Only in recent years I learned how important the Amazon is, not just for the forest and the climate, but also for the water. And not because we have huge rivers, not just because we have huge rivers in the Amazon, but also because the ecosystem of the Amazon make us to have immense floating rivers, that's how we call it, because of the humidity that ecosystem provides. The amount of water that floats in the sky is even bigger than the water that we have in the rivers itself, and that is crucial for the climate and the production that we have in the region and of course in the country. So Indigenous people in Latin America are also responsible for maintaining the food security because they practice a millennial practice of management of different species of plants, seeds, and all of that become the basis of the food system, not only for indigenous people, but also for the non-indigenous societies. In Latin America, we have the biggest number of uncontacted indigenous peoples or groups. There is an estimated report from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights that there are approximately 200 different uncontacted indigenous people, accounting for near approximately, because this number is not for sure since they're uncontacted, but approximately 10,000 people that live in volunteer isolation. And Brazil is the country that has the biggest number of those groups. The government recognized 26 indigenous groups living in volunteer isolation, all of them in the Amazon region. And the government also holds information of other at least 110 different groups. Brazil is also home to 305 different indigenous people who speak 280 different languages. So although the population of indigenous people in Brazil is near 1%, the diversity is huge, and we are the country in the Americas that has the biggest number of peoples and languages still spoken. So in the past 30 years, many of the constitutions and legislations of the countries in the region have been reformed to recognize indigenous people's rights, particularly the right to land and to cultural identity. That was a movement to overcome policies of forced contact, assimilation, and even genocide. Those policies were repeatedly related to the so-called opening of new lands for development, or basically colonization. Under the assimilation views and policies that formally existed until the late 80s in Brazil, it was accepted and even naturalized the idea that indigenous people would disappear at some point. In the region, countless cases of mass killings of indigenous peoples, sterilization of indigenous women, removal of indigenous children, torture, slavery were ignored by the state authority and sometimes even supported by the state. National Truth Commissions start to bring up those cases just recently. And for example, in Brazil, the National Commission of Truth found out in the cases that they analyzed, which are not all the cases, that at least 8,000 indigenous people were killed under the dictatorship regime in Brazil. And so far there has been no meaningful process of reparation, reconciliation for those groups. After the significant challenge in the Brazilian federal constitution in 1988, other countries in the region have recognized not only diversity, but also plurinationalism, such as in Bolivia, and further multiculturalism, such as in the Constitution of Colombia. And in 2017, just recently, the city of Mexico adopted a new constitution at subnational level to incorporate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as other international human rights treaties, to make it binding at the local level. Recalling that in 2017, the declaration celebrated its 10th anniversary, but its process of discussion and construction lasted at least 3 decades. So we are talking about a celebration of 30 years. And it's possible to look at the situation of human rights indigenous people in Latin America and to compare or to make different analysis of the pace of implementation of those rights set in the declaration. The most important international instrument for human rights for indigenous people. The declaration is a major victory of the world's Indigenous movement, with many relevant leaders from Canada. And I had the fortune to work together with Chief Littlechild, who has been one of the most important figures in the process of the construction and approval of the UN Declaration. And those victories and battles of Indigenous people are also bravely fought by Indigenous people at the national levels, and also at the local levels, with more or less resistance from the part of the governments, companies, and politicians, depending on the case. In my understanding, the discussions of the national constitution reforms to recognize Indigenous people's rights in Latin America and the discussion of the international human rights instruments have been mutually influenced, and therefore its process of implementation still are too. And here I express my deepest concern, and I will even ask permission to show you some of the pictures from the Indigenous movement from Brazil. And so this is not my presentation, it's some of the messages that the Indigenous people in Brazil want to reach other countries. Because in Brazil, likewise in other countries, we are living times of significant regression on the agenda of human rights, and particularly of human rights for Indigenous peoples. Constitutional rights set in the late 80s are being threatened to be removed. Long-standing policies of demarcation and protection of Indigenous land and non-forced contact of volunteer isolated people have its days counted as assimilationist discourses gain new strength in society and to some politicians in power right now. Although it is not always explicit, the desire for the extinction of Indigenous peoples, because sometimes it is even explicit, assimilation is now being promoted mainly through the denial of collective aspects of rights of Indigenous people by the states. Sometimes it's even framed as an offering of individual rights, as if Indigenous people would have to choose between having individual rights or collective rights. So in Brazil, sometimes we hear sentences like, if you want to go to school and enter university, if you want to have access to hospitals in the city, you should be no longer an Indigenous person. Or your people do not deserve demarcation or recognition of land rights. Assimilation is also a goal to many of the neo-Pentecostal churches and its missionary work in Indigenous communities. So the whole idea of building societies more diverse, more inclusive, respectful of other nations and cultures based on principles of solidarity, equality, are being right now tested in my country and in other countries in the regions. Institutions and policies for Indigenous peoples are being dismantled. Leaders are being killed. As a woman, as a human rights lawyer, as a non-Indigenous person, sometimes my heart aches and despair for what human societies can be or become or be back. But then I listen to Indigenous leaders and they say, we have resisted for over 518 years. This is not new, and this will not end soon, but we will continue to resist. We are just part of the land. But for humankind to live, we all need Indigenous peoples. And with this belief and the assurance that their beliefs and thoughts and way of seeing the world is how the movement continues to go. And that makes me realize so many things. But one of the things is that the context of regression that we see now is a result of all the advances and victories over the past 30 years that Indigenous people gained, and we never go back to zero. Therefore, the rights set in the Declaration will continue to be crucial standard and an international commitment for national contexts where governments threat to go back in very drastic ways. Because the Declaration is also a statement of international solidarity, solidarity among peoples, among governments, among societies, and therefore calls on each of us to be aware of what is unacceptable in any region of the world. So at the same time, it's getting more and more difficult to find good practices of implementation of the Declaration in countries of my region. It is also being more and more important to embrace the Declaration and its calls against racism, against discrimination, violence, and continued colonization. Because Indigenous peoples, cultures, lands, autonomies, and self-determination will continue to exist and to resist, regardless of preference of the government. And our major responsibility is to continue to protect the lives of Indigenous peoples. So in this sense, because Latin America has been found as one of the most violent regions for Indigenous people, I urge you all to keep connected, to invest time, to research, to engage with Indigenous peoples and organizations. In the region, new aspects of human rights for Indigenous peoples are being exposed, such as the situation of migrant Indigenous people. What does it mean to cross borders at the national and international level for Indigenous individuals, families, groups, or peoples? In Brazil, due to significant institutional racism, the situation of around 1,000 Indigenous migrants from Venezuela caused an alarming response from the authorities and have resulted at the same time in important relationship with the civil society, with the UN agencies, and so on. And if you're interested, I have just published a report on legal aspects of the migration of Indigenous migrants from Venezuela to Brazil, coordinated by the International Organizations of Migration. We are also developing a study at the UN Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People on migration, borders, and displacement. And we are calling for contributions from everyone that would like to share its experience, its research, or its concerns toward the theme. And we receive those contributions by email at the Expert Mechanism email. So the Expert Mechanism is a subsidiary body to the Human Rights Council. It's composed by 7 independent members, one from each region, each of the 7 social cultural regions of the world. And we have had our mandate expanded, so we are now able to offer expertise and advice on Indigenous people's rights to make member states and Indigenous people further advance in the implementation of the Declaration, as well as to promote and protect the rights of Indigenous people at the national and supranational level. So this includes offering technical assistance and dialogue facilitation upon the request either of the state or of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous organizations with a view to the implementation of the Declaration. We always say we are not an extra monitoring body at the UN system like treaty bodies or special rapporteurs, but we are in charge, or we are giving this mandate to facilitate the implementation of the so many recommendations related to human rights and Indigenous people at the UN level. But we also face challenges, and one of the challenges we are facing now is how to address the situation or the worsening of the situation of violence, killings, and criminalization of indigenous peoples, leaders, and communities, and how the UN is able to address it and treat them and see them as human rights defenders. So we will be discussing in a panel at the Human Rights Council session in 2020. And it will be very important that the civil society, indigenous peoples, continue to be present and to make those discussions useful for their lives on the ground. I think that's what I had prepared to show you. And I guess you've seen some pictures from Brazil and some of the main messages they would like the international community to know about. Because of the new government, they have been wanting to expand relationships and partnerships with international partners and other indigenous peoples, because they also see that it's not enough to have national claims when the government itself doesn't have any space for dialogue or listening to them. So I just thought I'd take this opportunity to also bring their voices here. Thank you very much.